All right, folks, what we're making at home this week, I'm calling texture tiles. So what you're going to be doing is rolling out a flat slab and dividing it up into different sections using some kind of design element. Now, all the examples here you see here are trees, but you could use starfish, snowflakes, sort of a geometric design, it doesn't matter. But you're going to divide it up using coils, and then you're going to add different textures between each section. Okay, so stay tuned for how to make this.
Hi guys, welcome to our distance ceramic lesson. I am working on my floor today because it's just the best place to work, and I have my lovely assistant. You may see him on camera at some point today. My son Toby is over here playing Play-Doh while I am playing with clay. So we're gonna have a good time playing around with our clay, right Toby? Right, okay. Okay, so you guys by now have made your homemade clay. As I said with my recipes, I like that second recipe on the list using baking soda and cornstarch, but whatever you're working with, that's fine, okay? So I've got my clay. Some supplies you're probably gonna wanna gather up before you start working. You're gonna want a little bit of water. If you have a paintbrush around, grab a paintbrush. You're gonna want something you can roll out your clay with. Now this is my rolling pin from my kitchen. If you don't have a rolling pin, you can use a can or a jar of some kind, just something that's a nice smooth cylinder. And you're gonna want some tools and things that you can use to make textures. So I looked around my kitchen and my house and my yard even to try to find things I could use to make textures. So some basic things I found, and you're gonna have to get creative in your own house with whatever you've got. I found some toothpicks, okay? This is a metal straw, but I can use the end of it to make circles. I've got a chopstick, metal chopstick. It's got a fat end and a skinny end that again I can kind of poke with. I've got a wooden chopstick, and this has a square end, so I can make square shapes on my clay. I have some cool cookie cutters that I might play around with. I even found a screwdriver, which you wouldn't think has anything particularly interesting about it, but screwdrivers, you can often find they'll have different shapes. So a Phillips head screwdriver like this, here's my camera, like this will make me like a cross shape, okay? And then I also went outside and got some natural materials that I can use to make impressions or textures. So I've got these like helicopter things from my tree outside. I've got a leaf. This is a nice sturdy leaf. I know a lot of the leaves are new and real soft right now. I'll try to find a leaf that's a little more sturdy. I've got a piece of an evergreen from my yard, and I found a twig. And it's a twig that has some branches and things. It's a relatively interesting twig. If it were just this one little plain section, that wouldn't be very interesting. So I tried to find a piece that has some interesting shapes, okay? There's tons and tons and tons of things you can look around and try to find for making textures. Because we don't have glaze or anything to help accentuate things on our clay, we're gonna focus a lot on texture for this project. You're also gonna maybe want some junk mail, okay, these flyers. Your clay might stick. This is actually like a cutting board of mine, but it's real smooth. Your clay might stick to it. So at school we use canvas, but at home you can just use newspaper, junk mail to keep your clay from sticking, okay? So as I said, we're gonna focus on texture for this assignment. So I'm gonna take some of my clay here, and I'm going to, I don't need to wedge this, I'm not firing it or anything, but I do wanna make sure it's nice and consistent. and moldable. And if there's any like hard pieces or anything that didn't get mixed up real well while you were making your clay, make sure that you get that all evened out. And what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna put down a piece of my paper here. And I'm gonna use my rolling pin and I'm gonna roll it out. And I wanna make a slab that's not very thin. If it's too thin, then what's gonna happen is it's probably gonna crack, and I don't want that. So if you make something too thin, that's probably not real good for this clay. This clay can't take a whole lot of abuse. Make sure the edges are not too thin, so around here is not super thin. And make sure you roll in a few different directions to try to make the clay, as it does dry and shrink, you don't want it to shrink skewed. So you're gonna roll out a slab that's about the size of your hand when it's all stretched out, okay? You don't wanna make too big of a slab or too small of a slab. You don't wanna use up every last bit of your clay, okay? Okay, so once you've got your slab cut out, you're gonna wanna cut it so it has like rectangular edges. I'm actually you need, a ruler would be helpful to have, but if you don't have a ruler around, you can just use a piece of that junk mail to create a straight edge, okay? So I'm gonna make a rectangle. Try to keep it as even as you can. Okay. So there we go. I've got a nice rectangular slab to work with. Now, what I'm gonna want you to do is you're going to sort of figure out a way to divide your slab up, and it can be more of a square if you want, or maybe a circle. I'm not real picky about the shape of it, but I do want you to divide it up in some manner so that you have areas that are where you can apply a variety of textures. So the way I'm gonna divide mine up, and because I want you to show me those same techniques we were using with the clay in school, I'm gonna divide mine up with coils. And I'm gonna make my coils in the shape of a tree. So I'm gonna roll out a coil here. Now this is awful skinny for a trunk, so I'll save that and I'll use that for branches in a minute. But I'm gonna start with a trunk shape, okay? So that's sort of a more appropriate size. But one thing I have figured out from messing around with this clay is that if you make it too thick, it takes a very long time to dry. And also if you make it too thin, it tends to crack. So you want to kind of make it in such a way that it has the ability for air to get to it and to dry. So try not to make it too thick. But when you start adding texture, don't cut into it too much. So when you're ready to attach the clay to the surface of your slab, and I'm gonna trim this off, and this is taller than I want to have plenty of space up here to make my tree, make all my branches. So when you are ready to attach the clay, you can just use a little bit of water, and preferably a paintbrush. If you don't have a paintbrush, you can use your finger, but a paintbrush is a better choice. So look around and see if you can find a little paintbrush. It does not need to be a fancy artist paintbrush, just something that will put the water on there. And just a little bit of water will get it to stick. It'll stick once it's dry, all right? So now I'm gonna add a few more branches to my tree. And my goal here, again, is to divide up the space into sections so that I can apply some different textures across the piece later. If you need to blend pieces together, you can put a little finger or a little water on your finger and do a little blending, a little bit of smoothing and blending. And you could make a tree, you could make, oh, I don't know, you could make like a starfish maybe if you wanted to do something more circular. Let me add some water under this. You could divide it up in a geometric manner with very square or angular shapes. You could make a snowflake, maybe divide it up. Maybe you're missing Christmas time and you want to make it maybe like a snowflake, any kind of design you want, but I want to have sections in between branches or arms or something so that you can play around with texture, which is going to become pretty important when we start adding our paint next time. You're going to be using, remember, either a mixture of instant coffee. Regular drip coffee is not going to work real well, so you want to make sure it's instant coffee, or you could use soy sauce as well. Or if you have paint at home, you can also use paint. Paint's totally an option if you have it, but not everyone has it. I'm going to keep adding branches here until I've filled up my space reasonably well. Okay, so I have made a nice tree here. And what I want you guys to do is after you've used your whatever design element you're going to use to divide up your slab, I want in every section for you to create a different kind of texture. Okay, that could be a texture with impressions of some kind. It could be a texture created with whatever tools you're able to find around your house. They can be organic, they can be geometric, it doesn't matter. But every section is going to have a different texture. So I'm really excited about this little branch I grabbed from outside. Mom, so I'm going to start with that. I'm going to push it in here. Peel it up. And that, I don't know if you can see it. That looks really cool. I'm really excited about that one. So I'm going to do a few more of those down here in this bottom section, making sure to turn my branch every time so I'm getting a little bit different texture every time. I may have to take pieces off to fit into tighter corners. Okay. But there's my first texture in this section. I'm going to use my chopstick here to push that in. Okay, so I'm going to add a different texture in every section. Maybe in this one, I'm going to add some dots with my chopstick. In this area, maybe I'll use my toothpick to add some stripes. Let's see here. I've got my metal straw, and that is great for, and now I have dots up here, so I want to try to mix things up a little bit, so I'll put circles on this side. And I can overlap things to kind of create more interest. being very gentle. This clay is not very forgiving in terms of being manhandled. Okay, this time I'm going to try using, this is just a little bit from my screwdriver set, and that's going to make these cool little star shapes, and that's pretty neat. So I want you to get creative, look around your house, find some neat things that you can use to make textures. Don't forget, you can add textures, and you should add textures to the thing that is dividing up your different spaces. So I will add some texture to this tree as well. I'm just going to use my toothpick to try to kind of give it some tree texture here. And when I paint these things, when I start adding water to them, what will happen is that it will kind of get darker in the places where the, in these little valleys that I'm making, in these grooves. So I'll get some different kind of accents happening with the color, with the soy sauce or the coffee or the paint that you're going to use after this dries. So do not try to paint it while the clay is still wet, because as I've pointed out, the water is how you attach pieces, and you'll find that the water will just kind of dissolve the clay, because this is all going to be water-based clay. So keep that in mind. Let's try my twig. If I need to do any kind of cleanup around the edges, actually I'm just going to take my toothpick and kind of push this in so it's nice and clean and straight. So let's...
The place getting open?
No, nothing's open today, my dear. Sorry. And there you go. So, couple quick tips. Don't press too deeply or too hard into the clay. This clay is going to shrink just like our clay in school does. It's going to shrink as it dries. So, what will happen is if it has too much stress put on it, it's going to crack. And when you cut deep, when you cut very deep down into the clay, what you're doing is you're giving it a place for it to just crack and snap. Let me show you what happened to my first attempt with this. So this was the first tree that I made. I even added a little bird on here. And what I did, and the lesson I learned was that, see how you can see these cracks? They go, you can see my hand through there. They go straight through, okay? What I did is I carved too deeply. And when you carve too deeply, as this shrinks, that's where it just made it a nice place for that shrinkage to cause it to crack. So a couple things I did wrong. I made the tree too thick. Okay, you can see how thick I made that. This one is much, much, much thinner. And I carved too deeply, giving this a nice, happy place to just crack in half. So keep your clay relatively thin. Don't make it too thick, and do not carve too deeply into it. So when you are ready to let it dry, you want to leave it on this piece of paper, and you want to put it on a cooling rack. Okay, just like if you were making cookies. If you have a cooling rack. If you don't have a cooling rack, what I would suggest doing is just letting it dry until it's a little bit stiff, and then lifting it, figuring out a way to prop it up so it gets some air under it, okay? But what you want to do is you want to sit it on the paper on a cooling rack. What that will do is allow air to get under the clay, and the bottom and the middle can dry just as easily as the edges. So after probably tomorrow or the next day, I'll remove the paper and put it directly on the drying rack so that it can dry on the rack, okay? This one that I made, it took 3 or 4 days for it to dry, okay? So just be patient. We're gonna be making these in the beginning of the week, and then not painting them till the following week so they have plenty of time to dry. Okay, guys? So, quick close-up of my tree with all the different textures in it, and looking forward to see what you all come up with. Thanks for watching. Okay, guys, so I've let my sculpture here dry for a few hours, maybe even let it sit out overnight. But the point is that when I touch it, especially edges and corners, it's no longer even really responding to my touch. Okay, so I'm not altering the shape of it when I touch it. Okay, it's a little squishy, but it started to dry out a little bit. Now this is gonna be different for everybody's project. All the different clays are a little bit different, and so you're gonna have to, check on yours every few hours. Yours will probably be different than mine. And the humidity in your home, and the way the air moves around, and whether it's sitting in the sun, and blah, blah, blah. There's lots of different factors that will cause it to stiffen up sooner. But the point is, once it's stiff enough to kind of hold its own shape without being too damaged by movement, what you're gonna wanna do is remove it from the paper, because you want air to get underneath. And once I stick my fingers under here, I can feel that it's already drier on top than it is on the bottom. So I'm gonna very carefully slide my hand under this, trying not to mess up the shape of it too much, and remove the paper and let it sit directly on my drying rack. So now air is getting underneath here, okay, underneath the drying rack to the bottom of my sculpture. And now it will be less likely to crack while I am letting it dry, okay? If you don't have a cookie sheet like this, you could try to kind of maybe flip it onto a cloth rag every, I don't know, maybe twice a day. Set an alarm on your phone. So you could take like a kitchen towel, like I've got in here. Okay, so I could take this, and for a few hours I could flip it this way just to get it to stiffen up on this side, and then I could come back and flip it back onto the flat side a few hours later. You would want to do this 2 to 4 times a day to get it to dry nice and flat without cracking, okay? I know one of the recipes recommends going ahead and baking your object, which you can give it a shot. Make sure that you monitor it while you're baking. So monitor it drying and make sure it dries evenly and doesn't crack. And if it cracks, send me an email. It's probably not gonna be a huge deal. If it cracks a little bit in some places, like I might lose some definition here between these two branches, that's not a huge deal. But if the project totally cracks in half, just shoot me an email, don't stress. All right, thanks guys.